Good morning, everyone. We're just going to let everyone get logged in and settled. Let's give it one more quick minute and we'll go ahead and get started. Chris, I assume we're already recording the webinar. I would just like to welcome everyone. I'm Dina Jensen. I'm the director of the Center for Nonprofit Leadership at California Lutheran University. And today it's my great pleasure to welcome a very dear friend and champion for the nonprofit sector, Jan Masaoka. Jan, I remember I was a week on the job at the Ventura County Community Foundation in 2005, and I believe you were my first telephone call that I received in the capacity of the director of the Center for Nonprofit Leadership. And I've always really counted you, like so many in our sector, as a mentor and a friend. So thank you for joining us this morning. Today's webinar is going to be something that we had hoped to host in person back in March to take a look at a seminal piece of research, a continuation of the Causes Count research on the economic impact of California's nonprofit sector. And as we all know and are experiencing very, very firsthand, the world has significantly changed. And we are now in the midst of an entirely unique climate. So we've asked Jan to reflect a little bit on that, as well as how do we position and talk about the nonprofit sector in California. I also want to express some deep appreciation to the people that make this work possible, made this session in particular possible. This session is part of our COVID-19 webinar series, sponsored in part by a number of very generous event sponsors. At first, they were underwriting the really yummy lunch that we will definitely keep a tally of and return to as soon as we safely can do so. But a debt of gratitude and deep appreciation to our partners at the Campbell Company, First Five Ventura County, the Ventura County Community Foundation, Interface Children and Family Services, Mustang Marketing in Thousand Oaks, Kate McLean and Steve Stone, and Laura McAvoy and Saul Sholasian. With us to share a very brief welcome, please welcome Cassie Carter, a senior consultant from Campbell and Company. Cassie?
Thank you so much, Dina. We are so pleased to be supporting the very important work of the Center for Nonprofit Leadership. The nonprofits you represent are at the heart and soul of our community, and we are dedicated to helping you advance your work so that your organization is effective, resilient, and enduring. Campbell and Company offers consulting services around fundraising, strategic planning, data analysis, communications, and search. We are a national firm with more than 40 years experience, but we have a wonderful California-based team and a deep bench of experience and expertise. During this stressful time, we are offering 30-minute consults to help you respond to the current crises, and these are free. We have a resource page at campbellcompany.com/COVID-19. I'm based in Woodland Hills and very happy to brainstorm with you virtually, and as Dina said, hopefully very soon in person, and would love to chat with you with any questions you might have if there's any way we can help you with your mission. Your mission is our passion. Thank you again, and I'll hand it back to Dina. Enjoy the webinar.
Thanks, Cassie. As folks are getting settled, and before we get started, I'll encourage you to introduce yourself and your organizational affiliation in the chat box. I'll also share with you a couple of upcoming webinar that we have on individual prospect research on June 30th. This is part of our free program that will continue through the end of June, and then we will be reintroducing our modest fee structure back into our work. But I encourage you to visit our website to take a look at upcoming events. And Gary, do you have anything you'd like to add in terms of upcoming opportunities? And Gary, you're on mute.
Now I'm not on mute. Sorry about that. Yeah, Nonprofit Quarterly just announced a two-part series webinars titled Beyond the Board Statement: How Can Boards Join the Movement for Racial Justice, with Renetta Walker and Robin Stacia. So that's on Monday, June 22nd, on Monday, June 29th. So I encourage folks to check that out. It is free and you do need to register online. That's all I wanted to add.
Fantastic, thanks, Gary.
Yep.
I'll also invite you to follow us on our social media channels. This is a great way to keep up to date on what's coming up. And finally, I'll just invite, these efforts really do depend on all of us supporting our convening, and they depend on individual donors just like you. If you'd like to make a personal contribution to keep our webinars free and low cost, a gift of any size is welcome. And I'll put a link to that page in the chat box in just a moment. I'd also like to once again recognize our co-convening partnership with capacity building partners throughout the region. In the early weeks of COVID-19, we realized that the webinar traffic was quite heavy and that we should coordinate and leverage our collective strengths. And so I'd like to say thank you to our co-convening partners, the Nonprofit Resource Network of Santa Barbara, the Ventura County Community Foundation, the Santa Barbara Foundation, the Fund for Santa Barbara, the Association of Fundraising Professionals Santa Barbara and Ventura Counties Chapter, Just Communities, Leading from Within, and Visionality. A couple of final housekeeping items. You'll see that there's a chat box and a Q&A function in today's webinar. We're going to ask you to pose your questions of us and of Jan throughout the session, and we'll interrupt for discussion and dialogue throughout today's webinar. And we kindly ask you to use the chat box to share with Jenny Lynn if there's any issues, logistics, can't hear, can't see, difficulties with the platform itself. And then we will be recording the session and providing it to everyone who registered for today's webinar in a few hours later on this afternoon, likely tomorrow at the latest. So Jan, without further ado, welcome home to the Central Coast. We're delighted to have you, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Dina. Thanks, Gary. You know, I just want to say both Dina and Gary are longtime friends of mine personally, as well as of the California Association of Nonprofits. And I'm also happy that both Cal Lutheran and the Santa Barbara Foundation are both Cal Nonprofits members. So it's fun to see you guys again. Although this isn't as nice as actually getting to visit, but you know, to live with that. So, and I just wanted to say thanks to the people that are putting their names and introducing themselves in the chat box. It's really fun to see who's here. So I'm going to share my screen that has this presentation on. So just give me a second to make sure that that happens. Okay. And so Dina and Gary had asked for us to do a presentation on the economic impact of California's nonprofit community. And so that's what I'm going to focus on here. But at the end, I want to make sure that we have some time to talk about current policy matters, because we are basically a policy alliance. And so working on policy is what takes up most of our waking hours, I would say. So, all right. So, you know, I think everybody has seen a lot of economic impact reports, right? The economic impact of, you know, California's blueberry industry, or of the port, or of a new sports stadium or something like that. And until we did the first causes count study 4 years ago, it's kind of interesting that there had never been an economic impact study of California's nonprofit community. By the way, please write in your comments, and it doesn't have to be questions. Comments are good too. And I've also asked Dina and Gary to not just listen, but to participate, to say, interrupt me and say things like, oh, that's totally stupid, or like, or that's the most brilliant thing I've ever heard. You know, things like that are always good, or that's really confusing. So let's try to make this as much of that kind of interaction as well as a presentation. So anyway, this is the study, Causes Count, and we did that in cooperation with the University of San Diego's research team. And I'm not going to go over this, but I just want to show you that we did do a lot of research, and we didn't just make this up, and that most of it is actually based on quantitative research from sources like the 990s and from the Labor Bureau and other places like that. But we did include 2 surveys, one of California nonprofits, and one was a random survey of California residents who speak English. All right, so I'm going to do this as kind of a quiz. And normally in a classroom, right, you would raise your hand and stuff like that. But so you're just going to have to think to yourself what your answer would be. All right, so 1 out of how many California jobs is at a nonprofit? How many people think 1 in 14? If you think 1 in 26, or do you think 1 in 39? Answer, 1 in 14. Isn't that amazing? So 1 in 14 California jobs is actually at a nonprofit, which also explains why when you go to that family reunion, there are other people there who work at nonprofits. And in fact, if the staff in California were a state, we would be the 45th largest state. Now, how many senators does Delaware have? This is a quiz question. Gary, do you know the answer? 2, right. And how many senators does the nonprofit community of California have? 0. All right, that's why we have to be advocates. Right? And in fact, the nonprofit sector is California's 4th largest industry by employment. We employ more people than construction. We employ more people than finance, than real estate, than entertainment, than wholesale. All right, so the fact is we employ more than 1 million people. And how many times have you heard somebody say, what can we do to increase construction jobs? Right? And yet, how many times have you heard somebody say, what can we do to increase nonprofit jobs? So the fact is we are really a significant employer. And anything when you talk about, you know, recently, like we've had legislators and people asking us, you know, how can the nonprofit sector help generate jobs? And I feel like we are jobs. Okay, it's like we're not marginal to the employment sector. We're actually the 4th largest industry in California. That's a really big deal. Okay. And in addition to our paid workforce, almost 5 million people volunteer for California nonprofits throughout the year. That's really a lot of people. And that is the equivalent of 331,000 full-time workers. So one of the things is we are bringing the economic impact of 331,000 people, right, to California's economy who are serving as volunteers, not even as paid staff. And in fact, 22% of all nonprofit hours are volunteers. So it's not like this little marginal activity, right? It's really, if you take all of our volunteer and staff hours, 22% of them are volunteer hours. So those of us in the staff nonprofit community, I think, tend to overlook the economic importance, not to just mention the usefulness importance of volunteers. But I also want to point out that there are some really troubling signs in volunteerism. First of all, the rate of volunteering in California has gone down every year for the last 15 years. And if you look at this one in the middle here, we used to be 34th in the country in terms of volunteerism rates. We are now 47th. Okay, that's really a big deal. Like, what's going on here? So I think that you can see in the right, what we see is that even though the percentage of people volunteering has risen very slightly, they're volunteering a lot fewer hours. So that's why we're seeing these rates just go down. And, you know, we in California like to think we're number one in everything. So the fact that we're 47th out of 50 states, hey, you know, and I hope that the capacity building groups in Santa Barbara and Ventura areas will also be thinking about the importance of volunteerism, because I have to say, I think it's frequently overlooked in the capacity building field. All right, so this is the most important number we say in Sacramento when we say it like constantly, and that is that nonprofits bring more than 40 billion, that's B with a billion, into California from out of state. So typically, politicians and nonprofits, we tend to think of us as using California money. The fact is we bring $40 billion into California from out of state. And we do that from some very important sources. One is federal money. We bring in large amounts of federal money through things like Medicare, for example, you know, HUD money, things like that. We bring in money from out-of-state foundations like the Carnegie Foundation, for example, or the Gates Foundation. And then, you know, California nonprofits have individual contributors all over the world, right? People, you know, internationally recognized nonprofits like the Sierra Club, which is headquartered in California, receive donations. So all these things add up to $40 billion a year that we bring into California. And this really changes the way that we frame the whole discussion. So for example, you know, in the Central Valley, for example, a lot of times the business tends to be agriculture, and nonprofits tend to be focused on farm worker services and environmental health. Okay, and so they tend to be kind of at odds with one another. If we change that framing to how can we work together to bring in money from the federal government into this area, then we can build a farm worker clinic with that federal money. So we're bringing money in. It's better health for farm workers, which everybody wants. It's jobs. It's money into the community. So it changes the way we think about partnerships when we think about bringing money in, as opposed to using money in a different way. Okay, now 37% of nonprofit funding comes from only one of these 6 sources. Okay, so which one do you think it is? And for this one, I've taken out the information for hospitals and universities because they tend to slant the results. So, and every chart in the report actually will say whether or not it includes hospitals and universities or doesn't. All right, so how many people think that 37% comes from foundations? How many people think from government? Fees for service, individual giving, corporate giving, or squeezed from stones? All right, got your answer in your mind? There's, oops, sorry. What happened here? I have an oversensitive mouse. 37% comes from program revenue from fees for service. Okay, and 30% comes from government. So the fact is, and you know, if you have government contracts, you know that it's earned money. That's not like a gift. You know, you get paid for the number of meals that you serve seniors or something like that. So the reality is that 2/3 of our money comes from earned income. And I think that that's something that's very important to notice. Now, 27% comes from individual donations, foundation grants, and corporate grants, and those are lumped together. We do know that foundation grants and corporate grants typically hover just below 5% each. So individual donations are important, but most people, when we do this presentation, vote for individual donations as the largest. And we've given a lot of thought to why that is. And I think one of the reasons is that, you know, we all see the requests for individual donations every day, right? We get them in our inbox, we get them in our mail, we get them on the phone, and people are saying to us, we need you, as opposed to other kinds of things. But it is, so I want to recognize the importance of individual donations, but I also want us to see that in large part, we are actually a sector that is paid for the work that we do. Are there any questions or comments about that? Because that usually gets kind of a lot of people thinking, what? That couldn't be true. What about dead people? Where are they? Dead people are actually in foundation grants, in case you were wondering. Okay.
So Jan, we did have a question about whether or not the volunteer hours that you cited a couple slides back include board service hours.
Yes, they do for an informal count. Now, when you can't, and you're on Form 990, you can count volunteer hours. But there's some really, this is what we call our public policy agenda for volunteerism. The American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, the AICPA, and I'm an ex-accountant, says, and the federal government agrees, that on your audited statements that you can include volunteer time, but you can't include time for board service. You cannot include time fundraising, helping to fundraise. And you cannot include times from non-professionals. Now, this is what, in my opinion, elitist and obnoxious and just plain wrong. The idea is that, you know, if you're, say, a lawyer, you can put that time into your audited financial statements, but you're for a person who's helping take care of an autistic child, that you can't do that. As if to say that that is unskilled labor, or helping a person in a hospice is unskilled. And this is an example of something that's just egregious and that we need to change as a public policy matter. So thanks for that comment, whoever wrote that. And of course, you know, in many cases, the hardest job in the world is volunteer fundraiser. Sense of, you know, hard work. Okay, but nonprofit business models vary by subsector. And so here you can see that this kind of darkest green is fees for service, right? And so you can see, for example, hospitals, 84% of their income is fees for service, whereas you can see international, it's only 8%. And you can see the different amounts for government and for other. But so I think one of the, but every single subsector has all kinds. Right, so the fact is we are really, every nonprofit is a hybrid nonprofit now. We all get all different kinds of money, and this really shows that that's the case. And you can see human services has a lot of government funding, for example, compared to other things, but nonetheless, you know, arts and culture is still at 33% earned income, so that's tickets to the symphony and things like that. I should say that, you know, one of the other interesting things is that the business models also vary by size. So that actually in some ways, and this is in the full report, you'll see smaller organizations, for example, across all of these have more similar business models than they do with the largest organizations in their same subsector. Okay, I have an oversensitive mouse today. I apologize, everybody. So one of the main things we wanted to focus on is government, because there just is not the same kind of research available for government. And when we know that government provides roughly 30% of nonprofit sector funding altogether, it's interesting that, like, when you think about how many workshops and how much consulting there is available on how to attract individual donations, and then how many workshops and individual consulting there is around how to get government money, it seems really out of proportion given how much more money comes to nonprofits from government. But nonetheless, the important thing that people don't remember is that actually government relies on nonprofits. So 32% of Medi-Cal services are delivered by nonprofits. So, you know, in these days, we've learned a lot about the food supply chain, right? There's farms, there's ranches, there's, you know, wholesalers, there's truckers, there's grocery stores, right? There's this whole supply chain that moves food to people's tables. And actually the nonprofit sector, we are the services supply chain. So in fact, for example, whether it's services for people who are disabled, whether it's protecting the environment, whether it's having a community chorus, all of these things are basically the services supply chain, and the nonprofit community is the core of that supply chain. And like any supply chain, government needs to protect and nurture that supply chain of services. But all of you with government money know that there's also a lot of problems. 60% of nonprofits say that the payments don't cover the full cost of contracts. Now I have to say this is something that has just come up. I don't know if some of you noticed a little while ago that the governor announced a new program for giving for delivering meals, cooked meals to seniors who are isolated and may have trouble cooking and shopping for themselves. And he announced that this program would also help the restaurant industry and that it would pay restaurants $16 for breakfast, $17 for lunch, and $28 for dinner for each meal that restaurants provided to seniors who could not shop and cook for themselves. And what he left out of that announcement was that Meals on Wheels in California typically get $5.05 for every meal that they deliver. And in fact, California Meals on Wheels all together deliver 18 million meals a year. 18 million meals a year. So you can't deliver a meal for $5.05. In fact, what you have to do is you have to raise private money to be able to make that possible. So this is an example of what it means that payments don't cover the full cost of contracted programs and services. Not to mention these other issues. I used to be a CFO, and boy, I'll tell you, the late payments issue was something that just would keep me up at night. I would threaten to set up my pup tent in Sacramento and sleep there until they wrote me the darn check. Okay. Oh, just one last thing about this. So this is like our policy agenda at Cal Nonprofits is changing this. And so we put a lot of energy into this. And in particular, right now, we have a letter that more than 1,200 nonprofits and 30 legislators have signed asking for contract relief for nonprofits during the COVID crisis. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in the policy section of this presentation. Okay, this is really exciting. So you may remember that 2 years ago, we sponsored a piece of legislation that your very own Monique Limon, an assembly member from your area, was the author, and that mandated for the very first time the creation of one website where every grant that the state gives out, nonprofits are eligible for, be on one site. Because if you know right now that you might be thinking, well, I wonder if there's a mental health grant from the state of California. Well, you'd have to look in Health and Human Services, Fish and Wildlife, Corrections, Juvenile Justice, right? All of these various agencies all have grants for mental health, but it would be just almost impossible to find them. So now there's going to be one searchable portal. And here's the amazing thing, it launches on July 1. We have been working with the state library, which was charged with doing this. And we had, some of you may be on our statewide grants task force that's been doing beta testing and looking at design elements of this as we've gone along. This is a very catchy name, grants.ca.gov. Anyway, you might not look at it on July 1 because, who doesn't have a problem on the first day, right? But this is, especially with the COVID crisis right now, it's just going to make a world of difference in terms of access, better opportunities, especially for people that just aren't looped in, right, for a variety of reasons. So we're really excited about that. And, I would be sending flowers virtually to Monique right now for her leadership in making sure that this is happening. Right. So even though we've talked so far about how big the nonprofit community is, we are really a sector of family farms. Less than 2% of nonprofits have expenses over 10 million. Okay, that's really little. And in fact, 2/3 of nonprofits have expenses of 50,000 or less. So, when you hear the phrase, my least favorite phrase, there are too many nonprofits, 2/3 of them are all volunteer. Do we think that there are really too many daffodil clubs? What's wrong with having a daffodil club in every neighborhood, in my view? So I think that whenever you hear that phrase, there are too many nonprofits, say back to them that actually there are not enough good nonprofits. All right, but in any case, we are really family farms. And the agricultural sector is very smart. It's dominated by big business, by agribusiness, but when they go to Sacramento, they put mom and pop farms on the stand. Okay, and here in the nonprofit community, we're the opposite. Even though we are a family farm sector, we keep talking about, but we have this gigantic nonprofit, and remember that this is something we want to celebrate, is how many of our nonprofits do what they do as all volunteers and as small organizations. And actually small does not mean low impact. And I want to remind you that the largest mental health provider and substance abuse provider of services in California is undoubtedly an all-volunteer organization, and that organization is Alcoholics Anonymous. And the biggest provider of sports opportunities for young people is actually the all-volunteer soccer leagues. Right? So small does not mean low impact. Right? So now I'm going to turn our attention a little bit to foundations. And you can see that, so this kind of golden color is foundations that are located in California giving money to California nonprofits. And the orange color is non-California foundations giving money to California nonprofits. So it is really interesting, for example, that something like Human Services, 72% of our foundation money comes from California foundations, but a really shocking, almost a third of it comes from out-of-state foundations. So I think one of the things we want to do is draw people's attention to thinking more about getting money from out-of-state foundations. You can see how significant it is. One of the things you'll see in the full report is you'll see a list of the top 25 out-of-state foundations and how much money they give to California nonprofits, for example. But in fact, California overall is a net exporter of foundation funds. We actually export more money than we take in when we look at foundation funds only. Right? So, you know, disparities matter. And this is a focus of our first report, and it's also a focus of this report as well. So here's back to quiz questions. Okay, so who has more money? How many people think Northern California? How many people think Southern California? How many people think this is why we should be 6 states? Answer, Northern California. So look on the left-hand side here. Northern California nonprofits have about $3,200 per resident. Southern California nonprofits have $2,300. Now that line across the state there, that is the traditional dividing line between Northern and California, Southern California, because about 50% of the population lives above and about 50% lives south of that line. That is right above Bakersfield at the top of Kern County. So it's and that's been that way for decades, that 50% lives north of that line, 50% lives south on that line. But maybe more important is to look at some other things, all right? So which nonprofits have more money? Rural or metro? Poor or wealthier? Mostly people of color or mostly white? And the answer, this is too easy, okay? Metro, wealthy, and mostly white have more money. And the degree to which that's true. Now, in this one, you see that the darker colors here have more money and the lighter colors have less. So you can see that if they're dark orange, that they have $3,000 or more per capita or per resident to serve people and less. So you can see these really big differences, but here's, I think, a more startling way to look at it. So this is nonprofit revenue per resident, not per nonprofit, so per person in the community. San Francisco is the high in the state with $14,071. Number 2, Santa Barbara, look at how much farther down number 2 is from number 1, and Calusa is the lowest with $97. Now look at that difference. All right, Amador, $273, Riverside, $591. So these are really shocking disparities. And the full report will show you that this is not just foundation money. This is not individual giving. This is not government. It is each one of those. So sometimes people might think, well, I can understand why a wealthier area would have more money in individual giving. But the fact is, wealthier, whiter metropolitan communities also have more government money and also have more foundation money. And this is, in my view, a call to action. It's a call to action for nonprofits in these lower communities to say, we are not getting our share, damn it, and to say to our legislators, you need to bring home more of the share to our area. I say that to both our members of Congress as well as to our members of the state legislature. It's also a call to action for foundations. No, we understand that if you are located in a wealthy white urban area, that's the area you know, and there's certainly need in those areas as well. But to think about, for example, if you are giving already to, let's say, the LA Philharmonic, also about thinking about giving to the Fresno Orchestra, for example, right? That there are, you can think about doing something about addressing these disparities. And nonprofits in communities of color, it's actually getting worse. Now, we in the nonprofit community, we often like to think that we are working against disparities. We are mitigating disparities. The fact is, we reflect disparities, right? So, for example, since 2012, nonprofit revenue per capita in communities of color has grown by 19%. So that's a pretty big jump. But in white communities, it's grown by 30%, right? So we're seeing just that these disparities are getting worse. And typically a nonprofit that's based in a community of color has roughly half the amount of money that nonprofits do elsewhere. So do in communities in general. So this is, again, a call to action for individual donors, and all of us are individual donors, as well as for foundations and for our legislators. I took a look at 2 counties in particular, Ventura, Santa Barbara. And by the way, within a county, and in fact, within a census tract, within a zip code, you can see huge disparities. So I don't want to overstate this. You know, the wealthiest zip code in our state still has very, very poor people in it. All right. So just want us to remind us that. So these are kind of these are kind of sweeping generalizations, if you will. But you see that in terms of ranking per capita, that Santa Barbara is second, as we mentioned earlier, and Ventura is 31st. You know, Ventura County has roughly twice the population of Santa Barbara. But Santa Barbara has roughly twice the nonprofit revenue. And then you can see here, the number of employees is actually relatively similar, as well as the number of volunteers. And although the number of nonprofits is different. So it's actually, these are 2 counties to think about, because it shows that how different they are. They're still not, neither one is still a very high population county compared to some of the other counties we have in California. But nonetheless, just dramatic difference. And again, we have dramatic differences in every zip code, not just in every county. Actually, I remember once hearing a speech by Tom Hayden. I don't know if you guys remember him. He was a politician who was married to Jane Fonda, the movie star. And I remember him giving this talk about saying that as an example in his zip code of the difference in wealth between people, he says, just for example, just look at me and my wife. That's kind of a funny joke. Anyway. Didn't go over very well. Okay, never mind, forget that joke. All right, so again, back to looking at foundation funding. Okay, so here we're looking at regions, not by counties, but you can notice that the Bay Area and Los Angeles have almost all the money. 80% of foundations are located in either the Bay Area or Los Angeles. Okay, that's where the money is. And some areas like the Inland Empire have less than 1% of the foundations. And even though many foundations do fund out of their areas or even fund statewide, it is an indicator of where their attention tends to be. All right. Here are the top 25 foundations that fund California nonprofits. And you can see that of this list, look at how many of them are Bay Area. Silicon Valley, Packard, Hewlett, San Francisco Foundation, Google, and Irvine are all Bay Area foundations. So again, you know, this is just a look at the disparities and the need for us. The concentration of wealth in our community is not just among people, but it's among our nonprofit institutions. And that's why we need to call on foundations to look beyond their own communities where they're located, and in particular to pay attention to the areas that are in rural areas, that are in poor areas, and that are in communities of color. But I do want to mention this point here. So Silicon Valley Community Foundation, you can see so much higher, right? One foundation there is giving 28% of the California Foundation dollars that are given to California nonprofits. But if we take a closer look, we can see that, and you can see this on the lower left-hand corner, 95% of their grant making comes from donor advised funds and not from decisions that the foundation itself made. So if you may be thinking, you know, my gosh, they gave out $1.8 billion in grants, but it's very just telling that only 5% of that actually was made by decisions made by the foundation itself, and the rest of it came from donor advised funds. So it just helps us remember, right, when we're and you know, because a question we get a lot from nonprofits is, how can we get access to donor advised funds? And the thing to remember is, many donor advised fund sponsors will say, that they are checking accounts for charity. And so you don't say something like, you don't ask Wells Fargo, how do I get access to your checking account holders? You know that you have to go to the people whose checking accounts they are. And the same is true for donor advised funds. And many of you know that donor advised funds have been a focus of our policy work as well. Okay. In terms of the nonprofit sector, I want to talk a little bit about our diversity in gender and race and ethnicity. So, and we're comparing this to the general California nonprofit workforce. So California employees for nonprofits, 63% of us are women. The overall workforce, it's 45%, and people of color, closer, 31%, 28% in the general workforce. But it really shows up in leadership. So if we look at boards of directors, nonprofit boards are 56% women, but Fortune 500 companies are 23%. People of color are 27% on nonprofit boards and 16% in Fortune 500 boards. And then in staff leadership, which we're defining here as a member of a management team, however a nonprofit defines its management team, 73% are women. Only 29% elsewhere, and people of color, 29% and 12%. So these are really pretty startling percentages. And this is another way, when you couple this with what I said earlier about employment, right? It means that when you employ people in the nonprofit sector, you are employing women and people of color. All right, and you are employing them in leadership positions. So that's an important thing to remember about nonprofit jobs, and it's another reason why to support jobs in the nonprofit community, because they have, these numbers tell you that we are inherently a sector that is employing women and people of color into leadership positions more than our counterparts in the for-profit sector. I also like to think it's why we're so smart about everything. Okay. Now, sometimes you hear, you know, a thing like nonprofits, we tend to like to say things like, if only people understood us. People don't understand nonprofits. If they only understood us, they would like us more and give us more money. And here's the thing, you know what? They already like us. Okay, we have to stop saying that, because they already like us. Now, for example, just look at this one on the left. 68% of this, remember, this is a random sample of California English-speaking residents, okay? Random sample, scientifically chosen random sample, right? The 68% see nonprofits as creating jobs. Only 67% people think for-profits do. So actually, they think we do a better job of creating jobs than the for-profit sector. They think that we are more efficient than the for-profit sector. We knew we would come out higher in terms of acting ethically and positive social change, but look, they are rating us higher on efficiency. Okay, so we need to stop saying, oh, like if only people understood us, you know, whether or not they understand us, they like us. And so we can go into audiences knowing and reiterating to people that this is what we do. We're the 4th largest employer. 1 in every 14 jobs in California is at a nonprofit. And the public rates us as being more efficient than the for-profit sector. Okay. Now, of course, we're a policy advocacy organization, so we also asked, this is our nonprofit survey, and many of you contributed by filling it out. have, in the last 12 months, 76% of nonprofits have met with public officials or their staff. I mean, that's huge. Now, sometimes you'll see the statistic that only 4% of nonprofits lobby, and that's because only 4% of nonprofits fill out the form that says that they're planning to lobby in the next year, okay? So, because nonprofits, sometimes we don't think that we lobby. When you ask it this way, we actually do a lot of that kind of work. So like people say, oh, well, we don't do any lobbying. Oh yeah, I did see the mayor last week, you know, at the grocery store, and reminded him that we need that zoning change, that parking change in front of our clinic. Well, so you spent 5 minutes lobbying there, but nonetheless, this is really amazing. 53% belong to a coalition that lobbies, like the California Association of Nonprofits. And we wish this last number, 50%, were higher for encouraging people to vote. And again, later this year, you're going to see more of our Vote With Your Mission campaign. I just want to remind people that, you know, given that we have more than 1 million people who work at California nonprofits and another 300,000 that volunteer at California nonprofits, that we are a voting bloc if we just defined ourselves as a voting bloc. And that if every single person who worked or volunteered in child welfare voted, we'd have better child care money, period. If every person who worked and volunteered in the environment voted, we'd have better environmental policies. And even before we talk about mobilizing our constituents to vote, even if we just mobilize our staff and our volunteers, that is in itself a huge matter. One of the things we like to do is say to people, you know, lots of boards have these policies like, oh, board members were expected to say go to 75% of board meetings or something like that. And we want to suggest that you add to it, board members who are eligible to vote will vote in every election while they are on the board. Because if you don't vote, you are neglecting a very simple way to support your mission. And because how you vote, no matter what kind of a nonprofit you're in, how you vote affects that nonprofit's ability to do its mission. It's that simple. And actually, you know, I saw a very interesting poster the other day, you know, and it said something like, you know, rally against racism, date, November 3rd, meeting place, your voting booth. And I thought, you know, again, when you vote, you're taking a stand, and that's something that we should all be doing and encouraging people to do, even when we don't agree with the stand that we know that they're going to take. Okay. And just a couple more changes since our last report. I mentioned that the growing disparity between organizations and communities of color compared to predominantly white communities, it's also true in rural. In 2012, for every dollar that metropolitan nonprofits had, rural nonprofits had 61 cents. Now they have 59 cents. Now this is before the coronavirus, but nonprofit wages were up 23%, but statewide 25%. We know from a lot of data that in a recession like the one we are in right now, that nonprofit number of jobs and nonprofit wages are more steady than the for-profit sector, but that in an upturn, for-profit sector grows jobs and grows wages faster. So, so if you work for a nonprofit right now, you're less likely to be laid off from that technology company like my daughter was, for example. I don't know, it's encouraging if you work for a nonprofit, not so encouraging if your daughter works for a for-profit tech company. Anyway, foundation assets have grown an astonishing 34% during this same period. And donor advised funds nationally are actually, since this report was written, are now reported at more than 12% of givings, and more than 12% of individual giving is now going to donor advised funds. So when you look at numbers that say amount of giving, remember 12% of that is going to donor advised funds. And then this is, you know, a very significant point is the shrinking of the middle class. Now we know in America as a whole that the old model was, right, that there were very few rich people, very few poor people, and really a lot of middle-class people. And we've gone to sort of what's sometimes called a barbell model, a barbell lying on its side, where we have a lot of rich people, a lot of poor people and actually not that many middle-class people, and that's not a good thing for our economy or for our well-being. This is also happening in the nonprofit sector. Our largest nonprofits are growing. The number of small nonprofits is staying pretty stable. We are losing the middle class of our nonprofits. Okay, and you know something like we know, for example, in something like baseball, that you can't have great Major League Baseball without having a whole ecosystem of baseball, right? Without having after-school sports, without having minor leagues, right? It's all part of a baseball ecosystem. You can't have great theater if there's only one theater. You need an ecosystem of theater. You need theater classes. You need community theater, right? You need all these kinds of things to also have great theater. So the fact is that shrinking of our middle class is something that is extremely worrisome, because it says that our ecosystem is starting to erode, and the strength of that ecosystem is the richness and variety that we have. If we only have, for example, big theaters and all volunteer theaters, we're just not going to have as good theater on either end of that. And especially right now that, we have every single theater in California is closed right now, that we need to be worrying more about the middle class and the ecosystem. And I think this is in particular a call to action for our foundation community, because our foundation community has the ability to look at an ecosystem or a delivery system. It can look at not just find what are the best child care centers, or what are the best hospices, but how is the child care ecosystem doing? How is the hospice ecosystem doing? And thinking about what investments to support the whole ecosystem, not just necessarily the best nonprofits within that.
Jan, I have a question for you about that shrinking middle class.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any analysis around which subsectors in the nonprofit sector that might be disproportionately affecting?
That is what we did not do that, but you're asking me that makes me think we need to do that. We can go back to the data and find that. Thank you, Gary. What a great insight that is. Thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions or comments?
So Jan, we have a couple of questions in the Q&A right now. I think it is, once you get started making meaning of data, there's always more data and research to be done.
Right.
And one of the questions was the ability to correlate the data on the total nonprofit revenue per resident adjusted for regional cost of living.
You can do that yourself, actually, because the data is in the full report, in the published report, which you can download for free. And then you can look it up in your cost of living and look it up, to choose to. But we didn't publish that, partly because there's so many problems with cost of living. I mean, there's so many different ways to measure cost of living, and but it's a great idea to look at that.
And then another question.
Although, let's just say so I think actually, in some ways, rural nonprofits, it costs more, even though the cost of living is lower in rural nonprofits, it actually costs more to deliver services because you have to drive so darn far, and people can't get to you on public transportation. So a lot of things, so sometimes I think, it is cheaper to live in Crescent City than in Santa Barbara. But on the other hand, Crescent City, services to children with disabilities is going to have a lot more expenses in some ways. Mm-hmm.
So another question from our colleague Maria is interested in, are there questions in the report related to nonprofit social enterprise activity? How many nonprofits are actively engaging in social enterprise? How many are running them within their organization or have created a separate business unit or even created a separate legal structure?
Well, social enterprise is not a scientific term. That is to say, it's not a term that people agree on a definition for. So in some ways, every organization that has earned income is a social enterprise or has a social enterprise component. So for example, a preschool, some preschools are 100% tuition. Some preschools are 50% tuition and 50% government subsidized. Some preschools are 75% tuition and 25% donations, right? But tuition-based is basically another way of saying in recast is a social enterprise, but yet we don't think of preschools as social enterprises. But they're earned income, you have customers, you know, they're customers, you can lose customers, you can gain customers, you know, you have market share to fight for. At California Association of Nonprofits, where I work, you know, in 1984, the people who started the organization started also a for-profit insurance business, which we still have today, Cal Nonprofits Insurance. And in some ways that could be considered a social enterprise, but because it started in 1984 and not last year, people don't think it is. So, because social enterprise is new, right? I mean, you can't possibly be a social enterprise if you started like, you know, in the dark ages of 1994. So I think that that question is just a difficult one to answer because of the different definitions of social enterprise.
And then Jan, finally, this is more of maybe a little bit of a rant, but could be just
I'm pro-rant. I'm a ranter, so I want to hear rants.
So the Center for Effective Philanthropy, we had a conversation with regional foundations yesterday about a study that they issued about making meaning to, you know, what was happening with their various grantees. Mm-hmm. And one of the findings was that, well, staffed foundation funders and major donors have been helpful during the pandemic. Major donors are significantly less likely to have talked with nonprofits that are led by women about how they will be supporting them in the future. And to me, that really stood out as the shadow side of so many of our nonprofit organizations being women-led. And they also had some interesting information, which was the flip side of organizations led by leaders of color, which was more positive, but the issue of gender really caught my attention, shall we say.
And what's the point that you're making, Dina? I'm sure is the point you're making that, I mean, you know, just, you know, women are just so much harder to talk to because we're just not as smart or as interesting as men. Is that the point you're making?
No.
No. Oh, okay. Just checking.
Not at all. But just that, you know, these issues of gender dynamics are very prevalent in our sector, and they continue to impede our ability to level the dynamic with foundations and donors.
Well, I think that most major donor decisions are still made by men. And I'm not sure if that report shows that, is who is making those decisions. But I think that, I know previous studies have shown that most major donor gifts are made by men. And that, so in that case, it might be one of the reasons why they may be more likely to talk to men than to women. So I think that I'm not sure if there's anything to comment on, except that, you know, we know that there are enormous barriers but we didn't set up those barriers. Those barriers are coming from other people, and we need to call them on it. We have to call people on it. I think, for example, you know, something like that, if somebody is giving a report, or if the capacity builders are doing some kind of donor education, that's something to bring up with them, not to just accept that as an unfortunate reality that nonprofits have to cope with, but to call on, when we talk to donors, say, you know, look, this is really a concern for us. What's, you know, what do you think we can do differently? Because as you know, when we want to ask people for money, we always ask them for advice first. Mm-hmm. And this is what we should be asking them for advice about. And also, I think I would also say asking them to look at dollars to less advantaged communities. And if people don't know a nonprofit like that, they can ask a similar nonprofit, almost always knows. So if you're already giving, for example, to after-school music classes, they almost certainly know after-school music classes in other communities that they could suggest as well. I mean, one of the things I think we need to do as nonprofits is every time we talk to a foundation and every time we talk to a donor, we mention and praise another nonprofit. preferably one in a less advantaged community, but we always do that because it's important for us to be constantly educating people about the ecosystem in which we each work and the importance of that ecosystem.
Thanks, Jan.
Yeah. Okay, let's see here. What else we have? Oh, so this is kind of our call to action for everybody. So we've all been in a room where something comes up, like, I wonder what the business community would think about that. Or, what does the chamber think about that? And what each of us needs to do is when that happens, we need to say, what does the nonprofit community think about that? Because when we nonprofits get to the table, we're compelling. When women answer the phone call from a major donor, we're compelling, right? But we don't always get to the table and we don't always get the phone call. So the fact is that we always need to be, and this is what we say to our friends in the legislature. Anytime you're in a committee meeting and somebody says, well, I wonder what the business community would say about that, just all you have to do is ask. I wonder what the nonprofit community would say about that. We have we have one in every 14 jobs in California. We're an important community and people need to be asking what we think. All right, just to let you know that you can, in fact, download the full causes count for free. You can also order a copy of the report to share with funders and board members. And I have to say, the graphics, you can see all the graphics are from the report. It's every page is like an infographic. And then also Dina and Gary had asked me to talk a little bit about public policy. And so I'm going to do just a little bit of that right now. But I guess I should start by asking, Dina and Gary, are there any other questions about the research that I can answer? Any other comments that you have as well? No.
I don't think at the moment.
Okay, great. All right, so just want to let people know that there's been so much federal activity, and just as it's never been clear how important nonprofits are, right? It has also never been more clear how important government money is. All right, and so the Paycheck Protection Program, I think many people know about it. It's for forgivable loans for nonprofits that have less than 500 employees. And you should know also that there's also just June 5th, just a few days ago, the new PPP Flexibility Act was passed that gives people more time and more flexibility in how they apply for the forgivable aspect of it. There's also these important unemployment insurance and EDAL. So you guys have covered these and other things. I know the Capacity Builders Network has done a lot of that. So I did want to mention the HEROES Act, which has passed the House but not the Senate. And it is a huge relief bill with tons and tons of money in it. And unfortunately, there's been so much talk about it that some people think that it's passed. All right, and we're getting calls from people saying things like, how do I apply for HEROES Act money? I mean, the answer is like, well, can't. All right, and so we feel pretty confident that our California senators will vote for the HEROES Act, but it hasn't passed, and there's a strong likelihood that only parts of it may pass. Another one to note is the Universal Charitable Deduction Bill. Right now, as you know, as part of the CARES Act, people who are do not itemize on their tax forms are still allowed to deduct for $300. And we know that only 10% of people itemize on their tax forms, which generally correlates with the 10% wealthiest people. So it's meant that only the 10% wealthiest people in America have benefited from the charitable tax deduction. So in the CARES Act, there's a provision that you can also benefit up to $300 from your taxable income if you've given $300 to nonprofits over the year, but do not itemize. And there's also a bill right now that would raise that amount so that there would be also if you don't itemize, in other words, if you're the 90% of the population that doesn't itemize, that it would be possible for you to deduct more than $300 from your from your taxable income. And that's also still a bill that's pending. And then an idea that's kind of not at a bill status, but it's gotten a lot of attention. I just wanted to mention it. It's the emergency charity stimulus idea. And that's an idea that right now was being kind of spearheaded by a group called the Patriotic Millionaires, which is kind of a hilarious name. Probably the best known patriotic millionaire is Abigail Disney, who lives here in California. And their idea is that for the next 3 years, every private foundation and every donor advised fund should be required to give out 10% of its assets just for 3 years. And the thinking behind that is that it would bring over $100 billion into the United States economy without costing anymore, because the tax deductions have already been given out. So these are some ideas of sort of that you can see the range of federal policy matters that are before us. But as California Association of Nonprofits, we don't do that much on federal matters just because we don't have the bandwidth. Frankly, we have 5 staff. Okay, so I do want to talk a little bit about California. Probably the most important thing that's going to affect California nonprofits this year is the budget. And we're in a very, so, you know, what there is to say about the budget literally changes every day right now. So I'm not going to even try, because it'd be out of date by 2 o'clock this afternoon after the governor's press conference. For all other bills, you can, if you click on this web link here, we have a public policy bill tracker, and it shows all the bills that we've taken positions on or are watching. And some of the ones that I think are the most interesting for right now, one of them is the donor advised funds, for which we are co-sponsor. And this would kind of affirm the ability of the Attorney General to request reports from donor advised fund sponsors. And it just got out of the Assembly, and so now it's going to the Senate. Regulation of fundraising platforms. This is a bill we have been working on for 4 years, and so we're really happy that it's finally passed the Assembly. And this is providing some regulation for things like PayPal and Amazon Smile, which behind the scenes have been doing some pretty funky things that really are not fair to donors and not fair to nonprofits. And this is an effort to hold them accountable. So for example, right now, if you're a donor and you make your donation through PayPal, or not, you know, I don't want to single out PayPal, right? There are hundreds of these platforms. It is not right now possible for you to find out whether that donation actually got to the nonprofit. And we believe that donors should be able to confirm that. That just, when we've had hundreds of nonprofits complain to us about this issue, because what happens is that they might have a campaign on Facebook or who knows what platform, right? And people will give, but then the money comes to them as a lump and they don't actually know. So if you were a person who gave $500, you don't actually know whether your $500 got to the nonprofit, and these platforms will not confirm that to you. And so that's an example of what we think is really important about this fundraising regulation. There is a bill that we are working very hard on, which is an eviction moratorium for commercial renters. Now, counties have already had the authority to have them, but we need to have it statewide. And, you know, I want to, you know, every single theater is closed in California. Every single museum is closed, not to mention, right, all the other things, senior community centers, all these things are closed. And if you lose your facility, it's almost impossible to come back. So this is an eviction moratorium. It's not a rent forgiveness, but it will give us a chance to come back. A student borrower bill of rights, something because we know that 160,000 nonprofit employees in California have student debt. This is an important issue for California nonprofits. And then 2 disaster relief bills, one of which is also written and authored by Monique Limon, that we're also supporting. In particular, they're making it easier for nonprofits to do disaster relief and also provide additional funding for them. And I want to mention the ballot propositions for November. I mean, you know, every year we have 200 ballot propositions or something like that in California, but there's one very important one this year, and that's called Schools and Communities First. And Cal Nonprofits has already endorsed this. And this would change the way in which commercial people who own commercial property pay property taxes. So it would affect, you know, the Googles, which are, you know, own thousands of acres, right? The big commercial owners. It would not affect small businesses, and it would not affect nonprofits, and it would not affect homeowners, but it would just affect business. And it's something that we think is really important. And then one of the things that I personally like a lot about this ballot proposition is the money doesn't go to a state fund, it goes to counties. So there will be a much stronger way in which there's local control over where that money goes than might not ordinarily be the case. Okay. And just some research that we've done just to point out about the coronavirus again. So what we've seen is these huge numbers of people that have deliverables that they can't meet during the coronavirus crisis. So for example, if you are a nonprofit that does, let's say, foster care, safety home visits, you can't do those right now. But you still have staff. You're trying to do the best you can with phone calls and kinds of things like that. But one of the things we have put into our list of demands is that, for example, that nonprofits with those kinds of contracts will get paid 1/12 of their contract, regardless of whether or not they're able to meet the number of seniors that are coming to their community center, or the number of TB tests that they've given, or the number of children that they've had in their childcare. And the ability to move money from one line item to another. So for example, we've heard from so many people that they may have had a vacant position, let's just say, in their mental health services unit, but now they need to buy masks, and they are not allowed without a formal budget modification to take that money that they're not using on a staff person and use it to buy masks. All right, so we need the ability to move money without the budget modification process. And so more than 1,200 nonprofits have signed a letter asking for these, and 30 legislators, including Monique Limon and Assemblymember Rivas from your area, asking the governor to act to make these kinds of things more flexible for nonprofits. So that's been a very important part of what we're doing. And I think we've actually made a lot of progress, although the governor has not acted. There has been a lot of progress. Some of the departments, some of the counties are doing this well, and some of the departments are doing this well at the state. But the problem is for a nonprofit is you can have 2 county contracts from different counties and a state contract, and all 3 of them are responding to these issues differently. So it's just impossible. That's why we need a statewide guidance that shows the importance of doing this. And one of the crazy things is the Trump administration has actually issued all of these as federal guidelines for federal contracts with nonprofits. And yet our state is not willing to make those same concessions to nonprofits' ability during this crisis. So it's something that we really salute Monique Limon's leadership on, but we need to get the rest of state government in line. Okay, are there any questions or comments on this public policy section?
No, not at this moment, Jan.
Okay,
but I'll go ahead and encourage folks in this last 15 minutes that we have with Jan to please pose your questions.
but you know, they can go have lunch early too, right?
You can also go and have lunch early. Unstructured time is priceless. Yes.
Yeah, really, we need that. So, you know, I think, you know, Gary, I wanted to give a special shout out to the Santa Barbara Foundation for signing not this letter, but the earlier letter that had a lot of the same concerns in it around COVID and the importance. And I would have to say that there were only 2 foundations in the state of California that signed the letter encouraging government to be more flexible with nonprofits. And I think that one of the things that we would like to see is to see our foundation community also do more to support the public policy efforts that support nonprofits, not just give funding to nonprofits, which is of course very important as well. So congrats to you guys and a shout out. And I'm hoping everybody will see that as kind of a leadership matter. And it's also, I think it's also a signal to the nonprofit community, hey, we want to do a lot of things to support nonprofits, and our taking 5 minutes more to do this is, you know, one way in which we can do that in a very important way.
So Jan, there's a really great comment in the chat box that says, Jan, thank you for voicing our rants in such a gracious way.
Well, I keep trying to stop ranting, and then things just drive me so crazy. I can't stop.
Um,
See, I have all of you on this session. You know, Gary and Dean are two of like the nicest non-rant people, right? So,
we rant in private, Jan. It's all
oh,
secret.
I haven't seen you guys do that. You got to invite me over for a rant, like when we can go back in person.
Okay. And Jan, I was curious. There was some coverage late last week about the Ford Foundation expanding their grant making, but doing it through issuance of corporate bonds. Any thoughts there?
I'm not sure that they were corporate bonds, but I think that they were other kinds of bonds. But in any case, anytime a foundation says they're going to give out more money, I think it's a good thing. I would say that. I think, you know, if you are a private foundation like the Ford Foundation, you know, you have the next 200 years to build your endowment back. You know, you do. And so people say, well, foundations have to think long term, and that means you have to think long term. In fact, you know, if we erode our portfolio, we do. We have the next 100, 200, 400 years to rebuild the portfolio. So that's a different way of thinking long term. I think that what I think that is a little bit misleading is that many foundations and many nonprofits already issue bonds. This makes it that a lot of the press conference made it sound like this was like a first in the history of the world. Just, you know, during I don't know if some of you remember, for example, during the big California government shutdown several years ago, and you know, remember that? It was like so crazy. But there were a lot of nonprofits that at that time, for example, let's say that they were building a new wing to their museum or a new wing to their hospital or to their hospice, or to their community. They were building a community center. And so when the government shut down and no money was coming out, you can't interrupt construction, right? I mean, that just will kill the construction project. You just can't leave it to sit there for months and months. And so what happened at that time is quite a few nonprofits and foundations issued bonds to be able to make it possible for nonprofits that were doing construction projects to continue doing that work. So we actually have a publication on our website called How Nonprofits Can Issue Tax-Exempt Bonds in California. And I do think that it's an underutilized method for nonprofits. So what I do feel though is that our foundation community and our donor advice fund community really needs to think about doing more right now and doing more for disadvantaged communities, because for example, Fidelity had announced towards the beginning of the COVID crisis, they had announced a goal of $200 million coming from their donor advice funds that donors would direct to the coronavirus from their donor advice funds. And they have surpassed that goal of 200 million, and they're close to 300 million right now. But I just want to point out that 200 million is less than 1% of the assets in Fidelity's donor advice funds. So even though they got a lot of press for calling for $200 million out of their donor advice funds, 0.6% is not really something we should be giving people a lot of credit for. That's something we should be calling out. And so that's a little bit how I feel about Ford.
Yeah, we have another question that just came in actually from Catherine Bozowski. Are there any particular trends you see for nonprofits that seem to be navigating the COVID impacts particularly well?
Well, you know, I think it really helps a lot to start with a couple $1 million in the bank. I would say that just like, you know, kind of that old saying, like, what's the best way to get appointed to the Supreme Court? Have a future U.S. senator as your college roommate. But, you know, one of our board members runs a museum, Lyle Jones from the Crocker Art Museum in Sacramento. And, you know, she was saying they're going to lose $2 million this year. Okay, you can only afford to lose $2 million if you have a lot of money, right? Not most people can't afford to lose $2 million. The American Association of Museums is predicting that 1/3 of all museums in America will permanently close due to the coronavirus. So I think we have this huge spectrum because on one hand, our food banks and our Meals on Wheels and our health clinics, right? They are busting through the seams. They are working at 10 times their capacity. And on the other hand, we have so many nonprofits that are closed completely. And then we have everybody in between, right? I mean, and I was talking to a woman who's the executive director of a youth program. And she was saying, after school youth program, she says, usually, you know, we have 100 kids in a gym. What are we going to do? Social distancing, another way of thinking about social distancing is it's 20% of what, so if your gym used to hold 100 kids, now it can hold 20. So they have two very challenging questions, right? What are all those parents and all those kids going to do? And the second thing is, how is this nonprofit going to be able to serve all those kids? Because they can't do those same number of kids with the old amount of money. So I would say again that one of the, probably the most important thing to do is to be a policy advocate. And I have to say that one of the things that shocked me in the reports about Ford is one of the newspaper article I read said that Ford's annual normal giving is $520 million a year. Okay, 520 million. And I was thinking, wow, that's pretty neat. And then I remembered that I live in San Francisco. One department in San Francisco Health Department, has a budget of 3 times Ford's total annual giving internationally. Right, so that is the difference. And San Francisco has less than 1 million people in population. So that is the difference between foundation giving and government money, right? So absolutely, that $5,000 grant from a foundation is absolutely helpful, and I don't want to say that that isn't important. But the fact is, if you're going to get million for our sector and for the middle class of our sector, it's going to be government money that holds us all up. Foundation money will hold some of us up, but it can't hold so that many of us up. So what I think is really important is being, this is the time more than ever when it's important to know the members of your board of supervisors. Because that is where state money and government money in California, that's where it tends to be most frequently given out. And you know what, it's actually so much easier now to contact them than it's ever been before. And so, for example, you know, it used to be, you know, I'd have to go down to City Hall, all kinds of stuff. Like now, all these meetings are held online and you can participate on them online. It's kind of neat. Like there's these telephone numbers that you call and they put you in a queue, right? And then you just sit there on hold, watching it on TV or watching it on your screen. And then they'll say, okay, the person on your phone will say, okay, now it's your turn to speak and you can give testimony without leaving. This has never been possible before. It always was possible to watch, you know, Board of Supervisors meetings, but you couldn't speak at them unless you were there in person. Now you can, right? And so this is also something that if your board members just can say, what can we be doing? This is something that's easy for them to do as well. And just, but advocating just even anything that's going on, just the ability to just say for a minute, say something like, it doesn't even have, they can be having a hearing on sidewalk repair on 15th Street, and you can still say, I want to take this opportunity during public comment to say the importance that what our child care centers are doing is enabling people to go to work, not only the care that they're giving children. And the Board of Supervisors really needs to pay attention to adequate funding for all child care centers. Because if we're going, the big picture is we have to move government money, not just individual gifts and not just foundation money. But again, you know, it's never underestimate the importance of starting with a $20 million endowment or something like that. So, so anyway, I just wanted to say finally, kind of just to show this, oops, sorry, just to To mention that, California Association of Nonprofits, a third of our budget comes from member dues. And so we really appreciate Cal Lutheran, Santa Barbara Foundation, and so many of the nonprofits here today for being members, because that's what makes it possible for us to do this kind of research and this kind of presentation.
And Jan, we're really proud to have two members of your board of directors representing our region, Jeff Green and Marcela Morales.
Great.
Really terrific nonprofit leaders that we all love and respect. So I'm really delighted that they're at the table.
And we just had a Zoom meeting with some members of the governor's task force, including the head of the governor's task force on the economic recovery from the coronavirus. And one of the things is Marcela knows him. And so that's just an example of, so in the past, we would have had to say something like, Marcela, can you come to Sacramento for a meeting, which would be a gigantic deal, right? And now we can say, Marcela, can you join us with Tom Steyer on a Zoom meeting? So it's actually, in many ways, I think our board members and our volunteers have become even more valuable as policy advocates for us.
Fantastic. Gary?
Well, thanks, Jan, so much for joining us, and also for Cal Nonprofits' commitment to our sector and advocating for us at the state. We're really are so grateful to have your organization. And I also wanted to just remind everybody that I did mention the two-part webinar series on Beyond the Board Statement, how can boards join the movement for racial justice. I posted that in chat for a link, with a link, so you can follow that to find out more. And I also want to thank our co-conveners. That's Center for, or Cal Lutheran University Center for Nonprofit Leadership, the Nonprofit Resource Network of Santa Barbara County, Santa Barbara Foundation, the Fund for Santa Barbara, Leading from Within, Association for Fundraising Professionals, Just Communities, and Visionality. And then Dina, I think you wanted to acknowledge.
Yes, just wanted to say thank you again to our event sponsors that made today possible, in part Campbell Company, Ventura County Community Foundation, Our First Five Ventura County, Interface Children and Family Services, Mustang Marketing in Thousand Oaks, Kate McLean and Steve Stone, and Laura McAvoy and Salk Julian. Really appreciate everyone spending their morning with us this morning. And Jan, a real pleasure to see you.
Always
Thank you so much.
You guys. Okay, take it easy. Have a good day.
Thanks, Jan.
Great.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.